programming our seasons. And so I'll start with a little story about 1968-69. A young conductor came to town named Thomas Madden, and he programmed a new season. And on that season, he put Mahler's Symphony No. 1. The next year, you can find a newspaper clipping about that performance and how brilliant the symphony played Schumann's Symphony No. 4. It was a very confusing moment, but somewhere in between those two, Thomas Madden decided to make a change. The obvious reasons being that Mahler symphonies take huge numbers of players, and they're also very difficult and things like that. Probably a wise decision on his part. I have nowhere near that kind of wisdom. But for some reason, Mahler 1 turned into Schumann 4. And so for our first season, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the symphony by reforming his original vision and presenting Mahler 1 on our first concert. Mahler is really popular these days. He's a big deal. People like to talk about him all the time and have big arguments about what things mean and about his life and things like that. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that his music's really cool. But the other one is that he has a very complicated biography that doesn't lend itself to easy answers. And so because we don't know a lot of these answers, you can speculate endlessly and come up with a lot of things that are just a little bit wrong but equally valid in their own way. And so even a simple question like, where is Mahler from, is a really complicated question to answer. What nationality was he? Well, let's see, he was born in 1860 in what was then the Austrian Empire. Does that make him Austrian? Well, he was born in a part of the empire that's now the Czech Republic. So that's a little bit confusing. So, okay, was he Czech? Well, no, he didn't speak Czech. He spoke German. But he just happened to grow up in that area. And even the nature of what we call the Czech Republic actually has two parts. One, Bohemia, that's the one that people think about the most. That's where Prague is and things like that. But the eastern half of the country is Moravia, who has a capital city, if you want to call that, of Olomouc. And so which one was he from? Well, he was born right on the border. It's actually, you can't sort of pick one or the other. So even if he was Czech, it's hard to tell like what kind of Czech he was and things like that. You also add into all of this that he was Jewish, and that adds a whole other part to his identity. The nature of a Jewish person within a European country in the 19th century is very complicated. Are they a Jew who happens to be German, or a German who happens to be Jewish, or things like that, or neither, or both? And the answer to that varies a lot depending on how racist the person talking is, frankly. All that set aside, growing up there, he didn't stay there for very long. He moves to Vienna when he was 15 to go to the conservatory, and he basically spent the rest of his life going through what I call like the first modern conducting career, especially the first modern European conducting career. So if you're a European conductor, what do? You start as a pianist, and you play a bunch of rehearsals for opera houses, and there are tons of these things. In America, a decent-sized opera company can feel good if they're putting on 3 big shows a year. In Europe, a moderately sized opera company will put on 3 or 4 a month. So if you are in that situation, if you're playing a lot for these rehearsals as a pianist, you're learning tons of music. And so Mahler's first gig, which was in Slovenia, in what the Germans call Laibach. It looks like Ljubljana. I don't know how to pronounce it actually, but that's the capital of Slovenia. I'm assuming that you all know what Slovenia is, but maybe I shouldn't. Slovenia is, it's on the Mediterranean. Here's Italy. Here is the Dalmatian coast where Croatia is. Croatia is that really weird C-shaped country. And Slovenia is mashed right in between there. It's very small, but it actually does have a coastline. But basically, it's sort of a blink and you miss it country in between Italy and Croatia. What's that?
I've been there.
Fantastic. Was it nice?
It was a cruise, and we stopped and it was along the Adriatic, and we stopped in Slovenia.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So there you go. All your Slovenian questions go.
No, it was a good stop, but it was in a winery.
Yeah, all your Slovenian winery questions go. But he was only there for a few years, and so again, he had this sort of advancing career where he'd stop in one town, and then he'd go to a bigger town, and then he'd go to a bigger town. And ultimately, he would have two of the biggest jobs on the planet, the Vienna State Opera and the New York Philharmonic. And even those, as sort of hometowns, are a little bit complicated because they're both cities that are famous for their kind of cosmopolitanism. Their identity comes from being mashed up with a bunch of other identities. If you're unkind, you might say that they might value things like style and glitz and celebrity more than substance, things like that. Not to mention, as a Jewish person, Vienna is one of the worst places you can be in late 19th century Europe. There's depression that comes in the 1870s, I guess, and a huge influx of Eastern European Jews moving into Vienna, and it's a very common equation. Depression plus immigration equals racism. So this is one of the hotbeds of anti-Semitism. Famously, about 30 years after Mahler's arrival, this is where Hitler would develop all of his racist ideas. And so ultimately, even Mahler's Jewish identity is complicated. He would convert to Catholicism. In particular, probably just to avoid most of the political issues that we would run into as a Jewish person trying to get this job, this huge job at the Vienna State Opera. So, yeah, even a basic question of who Mahler is really complicated. And it's not because we have a lack of information. We know tons of biographical detail. It's just it's all complicated. We know way more about his personal life than we ever would want to in any way. So again, it's not like there's not the information there. It's just it's the kind of information that engenders lots of theories rather than final conclusions. I think the other reason people like to talk about Mahler, as I say, is the music itself. One, because it's really great, but second, because it has this really complicated relationship with the notion of program music. And program music is just music that's supposed to tell a story. So Richard Strauss writes a piece called Don Juan. There's no words, nobody's talking or something like that, but through the way the notes work, you're supposed to sort of hear the story of Don Juan, sort of a Fantasia-like approach to writing music. And Mahler was really ambiguous about this. So he would write these really detailed programs. This part of the symphony is about this, and this part of the symphony is about this, and stuff like that. And then he would say, actually, it's not about any of that. Forget about that. And it's not entirely clear, you know, did these things inspire the symphony? Did he attach them later? Did he remove them because he really wanted to remove them? Or did he remove them because some people would take those ideas and run way too far with them, and he thought people were being weird about it? And so the answers to those questions, again, we don't really know definitively. Finally, even the most basic question, well, we know that Mahler was a composer. Well, actually, no, he wasn't. He was a conductor who happened to write music in his spare time. And as far as I know, he never got paid once to write anything. He would just spend his summers off in his shack in the mountains and write symphonies, and then go back to the grind during the year. So, Mahler's Symphony Number 1 is a perfect example of sort of these complicated elements coming together, particularly the programmatic aspect of it. It's often referred to as Titan. That's what we're calling it. We're probably not supposed to. At least Mahler tells us not to. Titan is a novel by a guy named Jean-Paul, who is I say Jean-Paul, he was German, but I can't say his name without thinking of it in a Frenchish way. And he there's supposed to be this sort of heroic figure at the center of it. But again, Mahler says, well, no, it's not really about that. And so it's all this sort of complicated things coming together in that way. If this music is not programmatic in any way, it's sort of strange that Mahler writes as the very first direction in the music, like the sound of nature, or like a nature sound. So if it's not supposed to be programmatic, then he shouldn't be calling it a nature sound. But that's what he does. And so let's hear a little bit of the sound of nature. You will hear birds. Not hearing anything. So a way to make this louder. things about the way Mahler writes is that his music has very distinctive characters. So that's another reason why it's always so easy to think of what does this music mean. So why is there a fanfare in the middle of our nature sound? Well, obvious things are sort of militaristic, but again, it's all sort of speculation. There's not an organ. As any string player can tell you, this is not the easiest opening to play. You end up, you're sustaining one long A for about 4 minutes. And there's 7 octaves of them. And I think that's probably what you're hearing is this sort of, this kind of pedal note that goes for minutes and minutes. There's your cuckoo. Offstage trumpets. Again, we've got fanfares, we've got bird calls. What are they doing together? Well, again, that's the interesting part. Clarinet player is doing his best bird impression as he plays that. You will hear "yum bum" about 400 different times, more than that probably, in that many different guises. That little motive is going to show up all over the place, and I'll point out a few of them. Here it's a bird call. Later it will turn into other things. Mahler writes his Symphony No. 1 in probably 1888. He's on one of his various little stints at opera houses. This one happens to be Leipzig. He actually has written a song cycle a few years earlier called Lieder eines Fahnengesellen, the songs of a traveling apprentice. And he's going to incorporate those songs into the symphony. And that's another reason why people, again, speculate about meaning. Does the meaning of the song influence our understanding of the symphony? So at this point, you're about to hear it, but let's hear the sung version first. This is one called I Went Out into the Field One Morning. Sorry.
Übers Bild, auf die Blätter schien, Nacht. Zwei Morgen übers Bild, auf die Blätter schien, Nacht von ihres Geld, ein Geld. Guten Morgen, ein Geld. Jetzt liegt eine schöne Welt, schöne Welt. Sie, wie ihr noch die Welt gefällt. Auch wieder ein Buch am Feld, hat ihr sich unterliegt, die Zimmer Sing a
if you start your symphony with a bunch of nature sounds, then it only makes sense to go into this song, which is kind of an ode to nature, about how beautiful the morning is and the birds speaking to you and things like that. So now we'll hear the instrumental version of that song. It's very similar. Starts with this kind of idyllic kind of attitude, then moves to a more ecstatic one, just the way the song does. You start by admiring nature and then getting sort of caught up in the joy of it. If you came to our concert last February, where we performed Howard Hanson's Second Symphony, one thing I talked a lot about with that piece is that the musical material does not respect its movement boundaries. In other words, in most symphonies, at least prior to Beethoven, you would have some music in movement 1, you'd have different music in movement 2, you'd have completely different music in movement 3. There might be some interesting relationships between them, but you never say you have the exact same stuff. Similarly, the stuff that you started with at the beginning of the movement is the stuff that you'd use for the rest of the movement. You wouldn't do weird things like add new music at the end of the movement. Those two conventions die slow deaths during the course of the 19th century. So by the end of them, in particular with Mahler, you're doing things like adding new music mid-movement and using music throughout your symphony wherever you feel like it's appropriate. And we'll hear a little bit of that within the next couple of excerpts we listen to. So for our next one, we'll hear the new stuff. Now it's important, I said you'll hear this yum bum music a million times. It's not completely new stuff, it's still based on that, but it's a different tune that comes from it. This sort of heroic horn, dum bum bum bum. Going to hear some more nature sounds. Again, the strings are the real heroes of this movement. You're going to have to do that whenever. So you hear this little cello melody. It doesn't sound like anything quite yet, but it's going to turn into a new tune that we haven't heard before. tuba note's very important, actually. It's famous among tuba players because it says in the score, if the tuba player can't play this quietly enough, the contrabassoon should play it. And so it's a point of pride to be allowed to play that note. It's also terrifying. Very famous smaller moments where we get this new horn thing that just confuses people. Here. Now, again, it's confusing on the one hand because what's it doing there? We've already had 10 minutes of music and we shouldn't be introducing new stuff at this point. But again, what's not confusing about it is its character. Right? It's got a very obvious kind of emotional attitude. You might describe it with different adjectives, sort of heroic or something like that. But it's this combination of obvious elements being put together in unobvious ways that, again, makes speculation about meaning something that a lot of people have fun doing. I mentioned before that the music has no respect for the movements. And what we'll hear is, in this section, is a snippet from the first movement that's going to get played out a ton in the fourth movement. So in some ways, this music feels like it really ought to be in the fourth movement, and we'll actually repeat it almost word for word in the fourth movement. But it's related, but it sort of comes to fruition in the last movement. idea if this is true, but I also feel like Blomstedt is sort of the Mr. Rogers of conductors.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. You're back this to us. Do the people in the symphony see that much facial expression change and bodily language change? We see you wipe your brow. Okay. Yes, we very much that.
Okay.
Yes.
Often.
They do.
You know,
I mean, he's changed throughout
right.
the piece. It's been very entertaining watching him.
Right. I think what strikes me about him is that he seems, yes, a sort of more good-natured kind of aura than some people do.
So he's not Dr. K?
Dr. K.
See, it says Dr. K up there on the left.
That's the Danish radio. Yeah.
I thought it was a familiar term for him.
No. Yeah, he's Herbert Blomstedt, and we're listening to the Danish Radio Symphony Orchestra.
Okay.
He's actually Swedish, for what it's worth. Conducted the San Francisco Symphony for about 10 years. But I believe, this is just a rumor I've heard, that he's extremely popular as a guest conductor. I think just because he is sort of a good guy in a way that many conductors are not. Yeah, and a very good conductor, of course, too. So the next movement is the shortest. In some ways, it's the most conventional. It's the scherzo. And what you do in a scherzo is you play some music, then you play some different music, and then you play the first music again. And we get basically that in this movement as well. The style of this movement is a Ländler, which is sort of a redneck version of the waltz. And again, it's up to you what that means to you. If the first movement is all about traveling in nature, maybe this movement is about the people you might find there when you do something like that. But again, what we can't get away from is this descending perfect fourth for music theory folks out there. This movement will start out with. Yeah, that thing will show up over and over and over. My time. I don't know if you caught that, sort of chuck, 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 chuck. That's Colegno. That means the string players are bouncing the wooden part of the bow off of the string. Mahler, as a conductor, knew all these tricks, used them all a lot. During Mahler's time, people clapped between movements. We've decided not to do that anymore, but we still do sometimes, which is fine. But during the 19th century, the 18th century, that rule did not exist. So if you liked a movement, you clapped after it. If you didn't, you didn't, or you booed or jeered or whatever it was. At the premiere of this piece, they hated the next movement, and they did not clap, they booed. And
Where was the premiere?
Budapest. Yeah. And I think it's, as you'll hear, it's kind of easy to hear why it would be so confusing for people. Mahler described this, again, later he said he didn't describe it this way, or didn't want to describe it this way, but he first described it as something in the manner of Callot. So who is Jacques Callot? Jacques Callot was a woodcut artist, and he was sort of famously memorialized by E.T.A. Hoffmann, who was a writer-composer, famous sort of figure of German Romanticism. I'm actually going to read you a part of what E.T.A. Hoffmann says about Jacques Callot. Some of it has something to do with this movement, but more of it, I think, if you know Mahler's music, it actually sounds a lot like he's describing the way Mahler thinks, or maybe Mahler is taking this for himself. So E.T.A. Hoffmann is talking about why he likes Callot's woodcuts, and he's sort of directing this at Callot himself. If I stare long enough at your teeming compositions, created from the most varied elements, thousands upon thousands of figures spring to life, and each in the most natural colors stride energetically forward from the deepest background, like, the opening of the first movement, where at first they were just barely distinguishable, right? Like that cello tune which sort of barely existed and then morphed into a real thing. No other artist has Callot's ability to compress such a crowd of objects in so small a space without confusing the observer. The commonest everyday scene is peasant dance, for example, set before musicians perched like little birds in the trees, glows with a certain romantic originality that appeals wondrously to imaginative souls. Irony, which mocks mankind's wretched endeavors by juxtaposing the human and the animal, resides only in a profound intellect. To serious, penetrating viewers of Callot's grotesque man-beast figures, irony reveals all the secret meanings of life. So what you're looking at there is not a woodcut by Callot. It's a woodcut by somebody else. We're not sure whether Mahler got confused or whether he just sort of combined the two. But this is by a guy named Schwind. And what it depicts is the hunter's funeral. You'll notice that all the animals of the forest are sitting there crying for the dead hunter, which is a little bit strange given that he won't be killing them anymore. But we've got instrumentalists in front, and it's based on a folktale where a Bohemian band starts playing along with them. So for movement 3, what we have is a funeral march. It uses a nursery rhyme. This is sort of a children's tale, one that you all know, Frere Jacques. But it also has interruptions from a Bohemian folk band in the middle of it. And combining these things into one really bothered the audience when they first heard it. The choice of Frere Jacques, I actually think, is kind of interesting. In English we call the words, are you sleeping, Brother John, morning bells are ringing, ding dong ding, which is actually a pretty bad translation of the French. First of all, brother in this case means brother as in a monk, so a better word would probably be friar. It's a more close translation. And also, sonne les matines doesn't mean morning bells are ringing. It means ring the morning bells. It means exactly the opposite. The bells are not ringing. So, Brother John, wake up and ring the bells. And so you can make a case that if you want to get morbid about things, and I generally do, that perhaps the reason he's not ringing these bells is that he's dead. He can't wake up to ring the bells the way he's supposed to. That's, again, pure speculation on my part, whether that makes this as a funeral tune more important. For our purposes, the main things to hear are, again, we cannot get away from this. Only we'll hear it like this. in our timpani part. Then we'll hear the Frere Jacques. It'll be in this weird minor version of it. And then, as I say, they'll be interrupted by a local town band. Famous bass part. And just like when you were a kid, how you would sing this in canon in a round, we will play it in a round. Bassoon stern. Next are the cellos. Tuba solo. Interrupting woodwinds. This movement is one of the ones that reflects Mahler's Jewish identity for a few reasons. There's this tune here, I don't know if it's traditionally Jewish or not. People think this sounds like Fiddler on the Roof, If I Were a Rich Man. You also get this high clarinet, which is a very common klezmer sound. Here's the band. I'll stop it there for now. Like the first movement, after we've heard this funeral, we go back to one of Mahler's songs. Go back to the songs of a traveling apprentice. And this one is about someone who is tormented by the eyes of his former love and sits underneath a tree to get happy again. So let's hear a bit of that. Let's bring this up. So we will hear the happiness under the tree part. Let's hear the orchestra play it. We even ended the same way with those flutes playing that kind of drum beat rhythm. But you can hear how the way this is written practically begs you to find some kind of meaning in it, right? We've got a funeral march that uses a nursery rhyme and a town band, and a middle section that's taken from a song that has lyrics. And for all that Mahler says you shouldn't find extra musical meaning in this stuff, or you're not supposed to, or I'm not going to tell you what it is, it still encourages us to sort of endlessly speculate as to what's going on. Even the opening of the last movement is marked stormily agitated, which is not, of course, just a character thing. That's actually a description of a natural event, right? So if we have one vision of nature at the beginning of the first movement, we have a very different vision of nature at the beginning of the fourth. And it has a very strong programmatic opening, which consists of a flash of lightning in the form of a cymbal crash and thunder in the form of giant drum rolls. And it takes about 5 minutes for this gigantic tempest to sort of die down. occurs, which is really more movement music. That's this. That's that music, the first movement, exploding. Step in the hole. Yeah, so the storm sort of dies, basically. So we get this really, really gorgeous music that I'm not going to play for you after this. Again, it's up to you to decide what it's doing there. As I said before, this movement basically steals from the first movement, or maybe the first movement stole from the fourth movement. But all the movement 4 stuff is in here now. But that doesn't mean that the first movement's not going to show up. And we actually get some of those original nature sounds sort of near the end of the fourth movement. And one way of thinking of this is maybe that sort of a calming force on the storm that allows us to reach this kind of triumphant ending. But again, I'm just spitballing. So it's up to you to decide what you hear there. I will play that passage. Hopefully we can make it to the end. It'll be close. All these same little fanfares that we had at the very beginning of the piece. And of course, bird noises. We're even going to hear a little bit of going out one morning into the field. Heard this music before. It's the one where they usually show the harp, sort of chromatic ascent. Just going out into the field, into the soup. Completely in the wrong spot. I'm just speculating. Somehow I think that going back to the first movement, we'll get some stormy music again soon, but it allows us to get through the storm into this really sort of heroic, triumphant ending. famous viola part. Now it is all over with the shouting. Any questions about that? Yeah.
He was a contemporary, more or less, of Brahms, Wagner, Bruckner, and I don't hear them except maybe Bruckner.
Yeah, well, you know, he was substantially by death date more so than by birth date. He didn't live very long. He lived to be 51, I guess, in 1860 to 1911. And so someone like Brahms was 1833, Wagner is 1813, something like that. And so he is younger than a lot of them. But yeah, I mean, 1888, you're talking about the very last pieces by Brahms. You're talking, yes, Bruckner and things like that. He was not well respected as a composer in his own time. People thought that his music was sort of derivative and kind of, I don't know, obvious or something like that. A lot of people speculate because his identity was sort of made up of so many other identities, it was kind of hard for him to find a certain style. So therefore, he would just sort of mash every style that he could come up with together. And yeah, I think you're right. I certainly don't hear a lot of Brahms in the music that he writes. In particular, this is getting a little bit into the weeds. Mahler is bad at counterpoints by the academic sense of the word. There are a lot of broken rules and things like that. Brahms was fantastically good at counterpoint. He used to do counterpoint exercises with his coffee every morning. But yeah, Mahler's approach was so much different. If Brahms is someone who is worried about sort of construction and making sure that all the pieces fit together in elegant ways, Mahler is much more sort of throw everything into the pot and see what happens.
Did he study composition with anybody?
I'm not sure about that. His time in Vienna, I'm sure he took some composition there at the conservatory. He was a pianist by trade. That was his thing. We do have a few early works of his from his student days. But he and Brahms wouldn't have seen eye to eye philosophically. And there are a few tales of him showing music to people and them saying, "This is not music." That was their reaction. So,
I recall reading an essay very Bruckner, and they said that if that Bruckner's music percolates, Mahler is a sweet, just arches.
yeah.
I never quite understood what they meant.
Right. To me, Bruckner's music is Bruckner is very famously Catholic and was an organist and things like that. Bruckner, to me, is very kind of static in the sense like he puts up this huge edifice and it stays that way for a long time. Whereas Mahler is much more dynamic, and maybe that's what it means by sweet. It sort of changes and develops and goes off into strange places. Yeah.
I would like to say thanks for bringing in like the first piece of music that wasn't 60 years ago. The first piece of music, I think that little piece of trivia makes it more beautiful.
Well, every concert has some bit of trivia to that regard. Some of it's a little bit more fun than others, but I like that anecdote, especially since, Thomas Madden's not around to tell us why. So, a mystery. Yeah, Bill?
Where did you find all the musicians?
The entire state of Montana is going to be on stage on Saturday. It's we do have a lot more imports coming in for this concert.
And there's also a couple of other orchestras in concert this weekend. Am I right?
Right. Well, that's our personnel manager's problem. It's not the first time we've run into this issue. For Beethoven 9 last year, another orchestra was doing Verdi's Requiem, which has a gigantic orchestra. So we do find that we're often asking for the same players at the same time.
It's just incredible that there's that many available in Montana.
Right. Well, they come from far away. They wouldn't necessarily do that other places.
I like the camera on this. I don't know how he did it, but to see, instead of the whole orchestra, to see individual people, it's really cool.
Right, and we talked about that DRK thing. I assume this was for some kind of broadcast that's some Danish station or something like that. But yeah, it's very obvious that they took the production part of it into account.
Were you intentionally leaving out the Wagner part of the earlier question about Brahms and Bruckner, or because I know it's complicated longhand, but I was just surprised to hear that. Anyway, I was wondering if you could address.
The Wagner
That part
influence?
of the question.
Yeah, I think there is Wagner influence for sure. Some of these really long melodies, for instance. I said we skipped this sort of gorgeous part of the last movement. You can hear some Wagner in there. As a conductor, as an opera conductor, Mahler conducted Wagner operas all the time. He conducted Götterdämmerung like 400 times. That's probably not full, but dozens of times. So he knew those works really well. He was a huge admirer of Wagner. There's always this tension because Wagner is one of the leading anti-Semites of his day, and Mahler being Jewish, and there's always these questions about these musicians who love Wagner as a musician, what do they think of him as a human being, and things like that. But he absolutely, he was a huge Wagner fan, conducted tons of Wagner operas. Wagner wouldn't have written the third movement of this piece, certainly. Wagner, who basically wrote almost no instrumental music. The vast majority of it was opera, although you can make a case that his operas are instrumental music with vocal accompaniment or something like that. Certainly in certain moments and certain harmonies and things like that, I absolutely hear Wagner. I think the difference to me is that at any given moment, Wagner's stylistic continuity is very strong. Even if some operas are very different from other ones, he tends to sort of harp on one idea for a really long time and explore it and stay there. Whereas Mahler, again, is more likely to go off on tangents and things like that. You can definitely hear some similarities in the harmonic language, though. Again, Wagner is a better contrapuntist. He has more interesting ways of his lines. I would say more interesting. But his counterpoint is more fluid than Mahler's, which is, again, sort of chunkier. Again, it's a difference between lines that sort of combine and mix and lines that are juxtaposed but don't quite mix. I guess I would say that Mahler is that. Mahler is more juxtaposition of different things rather than using these different things to sort of combine into one idea, I guess you might say.
Would you describe it as a romantic composer?
Mahler? Yeah. Certainly his influences that we're talking about here, like E.T.A. Hoffmann and Jean-Paul and things like that, those are important figures of German Romanticism. These questions of, what is Romanticism? It's a lot to do with things like identity and personality and things like that, emotion. Mahler definitely taps into those culture, national identity, things like that. Mahler's very aware of those things, and those things come through. Certainly not a modernist in terms of someone who might be obsessive about construction. That's not Mahler. There's a Batman quote from one of the movies that's you either die a hero or live long enough to become the villain. I don't know if you've heard that one. Mahler dies in 1911. That's right before pieces like Pierrot Lunaire and Rite of Spring and these sort of like world-exploding pieces that sort of change everything. It would be Mahler's reception, what he would have been like as someone who made it to World War I or World War II, which he absolutely could have. He would have been in his 80s. If he had made it through the Nazis, things like that again, he was absolutely young enough to have done that. How he would have written music after that, what kind of political stakes or stances he would have taken in an era when it became much more obvious what those were. Again, that's all speculative at the moment. And forever. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
See you Saturday.